You already know this feeling. Not the name for it, not the theory behind it. Just the feeling itself, somewhere specific. The sensation that lands before any explanation does. Something in the chest, or behind the eyes, or in the jaw that won't quite unclench. It doesn't need your permission to arrive. This isn't about exhaustion from working too hard. It's not the familiar weight of too much on your plate. What I'm describing is something quieter, and in some ways more corrosive. The sensation of being constantly available, constantly responsive, constantly at the edge of whatever someone else needs next. The sensation that your attention has never quite been yours, that you've been running on other people's emergencies for so long that you've forgotten what a non-emergency looks like from the inside. You probably don't even notice you're doing it anymore. That's the thing. It becomes a reflex. Someone texts and you respond immediately, not because you want to, but because somewhere along the way you decided that delay meant something about you. A colleague drops a problem in your lap and you absorb it before you've had the chance to ask whether it was yours to absorb. In a conversation that should have ended 30 minutes ago, you're still there, still nodding, still making yourself useful. You didn't stay because you chose to. Leaving felt like the harder option, and you'd been choosing the easier one, accommodating, smoothing, absorbing, for long enough that it no longer registered as a choice at all. In a close friendship, this can look like devotion. Someone cancels on you last minute, changes the plan, needs the thing differently than they said they needed it, and you adapt again with a patience that you'd recognize as calculated if you were watching it happen to someone else. But it doesn't feel calculated. It feels like caring. The two look identical from the inside, which is part of what makes this so difficult to examine. What the body knows before the mind does in these situations is that something is off. Not wrong in a dramatic sense, just off. A quality that's hard to name precisely, what remains of 100 small concessions that no individual moment could justify examining. And because no single moment justifies examination, you don't examine any of them. You move to the next thing. You stay available. You stay responsive. You stay. And here's what I mean when I say, this is a restraint problem rather than a generosity problem. And I'm not entirely sure that framing holds completely, I'll admit that. It might be more complicated, but the distinction I keep coming back to is this. Generosity is something you can measure. Restraint is what makes measurement possible. When you have no restraint around availability, around response, around how much of yourself you're willing to spend in any given moment, you lose the capacity to know whether what you're giving is actually generosity or just a trained inability to hold anything back. Controlled, patient, deliberate, these aren't cold words. They're not the vocabulary of someone who doesn't care. They're the vocabulary of someone who has learned, usually at some cost, that not every pull on your attention deserves to win. That measured is not the same as withheld. That you can be present and still be selective about what you make yourself present for. If you're watching these conversations because something in them lands differently than the generic advice does, because you've tried the advice and it didn't stick, because you're looking for something a little more honest about how this actually works, consider subscribing. Not because it will change anything immediately, but because returning to these ideas, letting them accumulate over time, is part of how the shift happens. What surfaces when you stop moving long enough to look might be less about what you've been giving, and more about why stopping feels so dangerous. There's a person in almost every group. You know which one. They're the one who answers first. Not occasionally, not when the topic concerns them directly, first reliably, in a way that's become so consistent it's stopped being noticeable. It registers the way background noise registers, only when it stops. The group thread goes quiet for 3 hours and someone, not this person, finally responds. And only then do you realize that every previous exchange had moved on their clock, not the group's. What you see from the outside is a kind of seamlessness. The responses come back clean, complete, without the friction you'd expect from someone managing their own life alongside yours. A question arrives, and the answer is already there. A plan needs adjusting, and the adjustment happens. A favor is asked in the half-formed way people ask favors when they're not sure they're entitled to ask. And the answer comes back as if the question had been fully formed, as if asking had been exactly right, as if there was no hesitation on the other end worth mentioning. In a friendship that's lasted long enough to have stopped being examined, this kind of availability becomes load-bearing infrastructure. It stops being something one person does and becomes something the friendship is. Plans get made assuming it. Problems get routed toward it. In a crisis, real or perceived, there is a quality of rightness that comes from knowing exactly who to call and knowing they'll pick up. The sensation that someone is actually there, not just technically reachable. There. And the person who is always there, what does their availability look like from the outside? It looks like ease. It looks like they're not burdened by it. Maybe they just have a different relationship to time, you think. Maybe they genuinely don't mind. Some people are like that, you've told yourself, organized in a way that leaves them genuinely available without cost. The way they respond, fast, warm, complete, no trailing hesitation, doesn't register as something maintained. It reads as something natural. And maybe, I'm not sure this next part holds for every case, but it's what keeps coming back. Maybe the reading is the point. Not consciously, but the consistency did something to the people around it, something neither side had a name for. What surfaces in these observations, if you look carefully enough, is that the person being seen this way has trained the seeing. Not consciously, not with a plan, but every consistent, prompt, seamless response has done something to the expectation around it. Something registers in the people receiving those responses. This is how this works. This is the texture of this relationship. And because it's been consistent long enough, it now functions less like a choice and more like a feature, like climate. In a long marriage, not a troubled one, just a long one, the division of labor that forms in the first years tends to calcify without either person deciding that it should. One person handles the logistics of keeping the household connected to the outside world. The other handles something else. The split wasn't negotiated. It just emerged, and then it hardened, and then it stopped being something either of them thought about. The person doing the invisible work didn't stop doing it, and the other person didn't start noticing it. The reliability became ambient, part of the climate rather than something one person was maintaining. There's something else worth noting here. The observed pattern, the speed, the presence, the absence of refusal, doesn't only shape what others expect. It shapes how others describe this person to themselves. They are the responsible one, the dependable one, the one you can count on. That description, once it exists, starts to function as its own kind of pressure. Not external pressure exactly, more like the pressure of a mold. The description defines a shape, and the person continues fitting it. Not because they've decided to, but because, well, there was a thought here about identity and expectation and how one becomes the other. But it's more complicated than that formulation, because the cost of not fitting it has never been made explicit enough to choose against. From the outside, what you see is someone who shows up, consistently, completely, without apparent strain. What you see is reliability at the level of personality. What you see is, by every visible measure, a kind of strength. The inside of it doesn't look like anything. That's the first thing to understand. There's no dramatic moment, no clear line where the cost becomes visible. What happens instead is cumulative and textureless, something that builds without announcement, without a single incident you could point to and say, that was the one. The body knows before the mind does, and what the body knows doesn't come with language attached. It comes as a slight reluctance before picking up the phone, as a pause, barely perceptible, before typing the reply that gets sent anyway, as something that registers somewhere in the chest when the notification arrives, not dread, not exactly, but adjacent to it, a quality that has no clean name. In a relationship where one person has been the emotional first responder for long enough, the sensation that accumulates isn't resentment, at least not in the beginning. It's more like a slow compression. In the hours after a long conversation, the kind where you've held someone else's distress carefully, said the right things, stayed present through the parts where staying present was difficult, what surfaces is not relief that it went well. It's something flatter than that, a kind of depletion that doesn't feel proportionate to anything that happened, because no single thing happened. The conversation was fine, you were helpful, and yet, the mind tries to process this honestly and usually fails. It looks for the event that explains the feeling and doesn't find one, so it concludes there's nothing to find. You're just tired. It was a long week. The feeling gets filed under circumstances, not patterns, so it doesn't get examined. It keeps accumulating. And the next time it surfaces, it's slightly heavier, though you have no reference point to measure that against because you never stop to look. What the body has been tracking, though, without permission, without vocabulary, is the specific feeling of having been consistently selective about what you cost other people and consistently unselective about what you cost yourself. Not in any single exchange, in the aggregate. In the pattern that has no name because naming it would require admitting it exists, and admitting it exists would require, well, something would have to change. And the shape of what would have to change is large enough that it's easier to keep not looking. The tiredness is real. The absence of a cause is also real. Both things are true at the same time, and the body holds them together in the only way it knows how, as a sensation that stays. The other person isn't calculating. That's important to hold on to. What they've built isn't a strategy. It's a model, a working model of who you are, assembled from evidence, refined across time, accurate by every measure they have access to. You answer quickly, so you're available. You don't complain, so you don't mind. You absorb complications without visible strain, so complications can be brought to you. The model gets updated constantly, and every update confirms the previous version. At some point, it stops being a model and becomes a fact. You are like this. It's just who you are. In a long-term partnership, not necessarily romantic, any pairing where two people have divided the labor of existing together, the image that one person holds of the other calcifies in ways neither of them notices. The person who handles logistics handles them because they always have. The person who initiates difficult conversations initiates them because that's their role. What it feels like to be seen through a lens this settled is hard to describe from inside it, because the lens is never named. It operates as reality, not interpretation. And reality doesn't require renegotiation. What the other person sees then is someone who is fine, someone who doesn't need to be checked on, who can be leaned on without the leaning being acknowledged, who, and this is the part that matters, has never indicated otherwise. Because you haven't. The image they hold is not a distortion. It's an extrapolation from real data. Every time you answered without hesitation, the data set grew. Every time you absorbed a cost without mentioning it, the model stabilized. You built this image alongside them, even if only one of you knew that building was happening. The contract that forms around this image is unsigned because it doesn't need to be signed. Contracts require two parties to be conscious of the terms. What forms here is more like a groove, something that deepens through use until movement along it stops feeling chosen and starts feeling obvious. The other person doesn't ask whether this is still working for you, not because they're indifferent, but because nothing in the information available to them suggests the question is necessary. You present as someone for whom this works. The sensation that registers in them when they reach for you and find you there is simply, of course. That's the quality of it. Not gratitude, not relief, just the background hum of a world behaving as expected. And here's what neither of them, well, the thing that the model can't capture is what it costs to become legible as this kind of person. Legibility has a price. Being easy to read, as reliable, as present, as someone who doesn't need handling, that readability was produced. It didn't arrive. And the production of it, day after day, is invisible inside the image it created. Neither of them was looking at the foundation. That's the shared blind spot, not the pattern itself, which was visible enough in its outlines, but what the pattern was built on. Because there are two very different things that can produce identical behavior from the outside. You can respond immediately because you've decided, consciously and deliberately, that this is how you want to allocate your attention. Or you can respond immediately because the alternative, the small specific discomfort of not responding, of letting someone wait, of being the person who didn't show up, is something you've never been able to sit with long enough to examine. Both produce the same fast reply. Both read as availability. Only one of them is a choice. The distinction matters more than it sounds. Seneca wrote about this with a precision that still lands, that most of what we call our habits are not things we've chosen, but things we've fallen into. And the difference between those two is not visible in the action itself, but in whether you could stop. Whether the stopping would feel like discipline or like amputation, that's the test. Not what you do, but what it would cost you not to do it. The person who helps because they've decided helping is worth the cost can on any given day decide the cost is too high. The person who helps because not helping produces an intolerable internal sensation, something that registers somewhere in the chest, a quality of anxiety that doesn't have a clean name. That person is not choosing, they're managing, and management looks like choice from every angle except the inside. What neither person in this dynamic could see was that the availability had never been tested. There had never been a moment of genuine refusal. Not a softened, apologetic, partial refusal, but a clean one, deliberate and undefended. And because there'd never been a real refusal, there was no information about what the pattern was actually made of. It had the appearance of generosity. It had all the external markers of someone who'd considered their priorities and arrived at a considered, measured position. But the consideration had never actually happened. The position had never been arrived at. What existed instead was a groove, as described before. And that's the thing about any pattern deep enough. It feels like a decision until you try to step out of it. In a caregiving dynamic, one person managing the health, the logistics, the emotional temperature of an aging parent, the sensation of obligation can become indistinguishable from love over long enough time. The two started differently. One was chosen, the other accumulated. But in the hours after a difficult visit, in the residue that stays when you finally have a moment alone, you can't always tell which one you're feeling. They've merged, and that merger is the blind spot. Not that you're exhausted. That's visible, at least to you, but that you've never separated what you're doing because you want to from what you're doing because the alternative produces a sensation you've organized your entire life around avoiding. The other person in the dynamic is blind to something different. They're blind to the cost, not because they're incapable of seeing it, but because the cost has been consistently concealed, not through deception, but through the same reflex that produced the availability in the first place. If not helping produces anxiety, then neither does complaining about helping. The same mechanism that drives the response drives the silence about it. The other person is operating in reasonable good faith on information that has been edited, unintentionally, at the source. They're not ignoring a cost they can see. They're working from data that was never complete to begin with. What neither of them could see, and this is the part that's difficult to sit with, is that the relationship had been running on something other than what both of them thought it was running on. Not love, not exactly, though that might have been present too, but on the need to avoid a specific internal sensation that one person had never named and the other had never been given the chance to respond to. The whole structure was oriented around something that had never entered the conversation, and structures like that are, in a precise and literal sense, unexamined. Not dishonest, unexamined. The distinction matters because dishonesty implies awareness. What this requires instead is something more deliberate and more difficult than honesty. It requires stopping long enough to ask which of the two things you're actually doing, and then being willing to find out that the answer is not the one that makes you look like the person you thought you were. That's the shared blindness. Not malice, not manipulation, not even negligence. Just two people operating inside a structure neither of them had ever turned around to look at directly. The moment itself was small. That's what's worth staying with. It wasn't a confrontation. There was no declaration, no accumulated frustration finally finding its edge, no conversation where the whole architecture of the dynamic got laid out and examined. What happened was quieter than that and in some ways more precise. A request came in. Ordinary, the kind that had been answered 100 times before without deliberation. And this time, for reasons that weren't fully formed into language at the moment of the decision, the answer was no. Not an apologetic no wrapped in explanation and alternative offers. Just, "I can't do that right now," sent before the familiar internal pressure could finish building into something that would override it. The sensation immediately after was not relief. That's important. What surfaces in the body in the seconds following a refusal like that, small considered the first of its kind, is something closer to exposure. A quality of having stepped off a surface you didn't know you were standing on until your foot was already in the air. Something registers before the response comes back, before there's any information about how it landed. The awareness that you've just revealed, to yourself more than anyone, that the previous 100 answers were not as freely given as they appeared. In a work dynamic, where someone has spent years being the person who absorbs what others don't want to carry, the difficult client, the awkward conversation, the task that falls between job descriptions, the moment they decline something ordinary is a moment of significant structural information. What arrived was information, not drama. For a colleague who has always been the one to step in, to cover the gap, to make the friction disappear when that person doesn't step in once, by choice rather than circumstance, something shifts in the room. Not because anyone says anything, because the person who chose not to step in notices how long the reflex ran before the decision held. The cost of that moment comes from two directions simultaneously. There's the external cost, which is uncertain and therefore uncomfortable. You don't know how the other person will receive a version of you that is less immediately available, and uncertainty of that kind produces its own specific feeling, somewhere between vigilance and anticipation. But the internal cost is the more interesting one because it's not what you'd expect. It's not guilt exactly. It's something more like the discomfort of coherence. The moment you act in line with what you actually want, rather than what the pattern requires, you become responsible for the pattern in a way you weren't before. Before the refusal, you could tell yourself the availability was genuinely chosen. After the refusal, after you've demonstrated that refusal is possible, that the sensation it produces is survivable, that particular story is no longer available. What the moment revealed then was structural. Not that the other person was demanding, not that the relationship was bad, not that the years of availability had been wasted. What it revealed was that the structure had been held in place by something other than desire, by a very specific, very old aversion to the sensation that not responding produces. And the structure, once you can see what it's made of, looks different than it did before. Not worse, just different, more accurately itself. The small refusal was, in this sense, the most intentional thing, and also the thing that cost the most to do precisely because of how small it was. If it had been dramatic, the drama would have carried it. Instead, it had to be carried entirely by intention, by something chosen and patient and uncomfortable in the quiet way that real decisions are uncomfortable before anyone else can see them. What happened next is where the real information was. Because the other person did respond, and the response is what revealed the actual composition of the relationship, the thing underneath the pattern that neither of them had been looking at directly. What mattered wasn't the words of the response, it was the quality of it, the texture of what came back when the expected availability wasn't there. There are, in rough terms, two things that can happen when someone who has always been present becomes, for the first time, selectively absent. The first is that the other person adjusts. Not without friction. Friction is honest. Friction means something real was disrupted. But the adjustment is genuine. They find another resource, or they wait, or they handle the thing themselves. And when contact resumes, there is no residue of punishment in it. The second is that the absence becomes itself a problem to be managed. The follow-up carries a specific feeling, something between confusion and pressure. A quality of recalibration that tips toward demand rather than inquiry. The message underneath the message is, this is not how this works. And that message, once you can hear it, tells you something precise about what the availability was actually for. In an adult-sibling relationship, the kind that has survived enough shared history that both people stopped examining what it was actually built on, the moment one person becomes less reflexively available can produce a response that seems disproportionate to what actually happened. A single instance of limited availability might generate not just disappointment, but something that registers as grievance, as if a contract had been broken. and what it feels like to receive that grievance, somewhere between defensiveness and a strange, flat recognition, is the feeling of seeing the contract for the first time, of understanding that what you thought was freely given had been, from the other side, quietly categorized as owed. This is, not to be clear, an indictment. The other person didn't invent the contract. It was built from consistent data, as described before, and contracts built from consistent data feel like facts. What the response reveals is not malice, but structure, the shape of what had formed between them, which neither of them had ever named, because naming it would have required seeing it, and seeing it would have required one of them to stop moving long enough to look. What continued to be possible after this? And this is the part that doesn't get discussed enough, because the conversation usually stops at the rupture, depended almost entirely on whether the relationship had something in it besides the pattern. Whether there was enough that existed outside the groove that the groove being disrupted didn't take everything with it. Some relationships, when tested this way, turn out to be more durable than the pattern suggested. The availability had been structural, yes, but the foundation below it was real. The reorganization that follows a considered, patient withdrawal of unlimited availability, in these cases, is uncomfortable, and then clarifying. Both people find out what they actually want from each other, which they couldn't have known while the arrangement was still running. Other relationships reveal, through the same test, that the groove was most of what there was. There was genuine warmth underneath, genuine history, but not enough to sustain a version of the connection that required both people to be intentional about it rather than just habitual. These relationships don't always end, but they change in scale. They become something smaller and more honest, which is, depending on your vantage point, either a loss or an accurate accounting. Both framings are true. They just emphasize different things. What reorganizes in either case is the distribution of effort. The weeks after a first genuine refusal, assuming the refusal is maintained and not quietly retracted under social pressure, have a quality that's hard to name before you've been inside them. Something shifts in how the person on the giving side moves through the dynamic. Not a dramatic shift, a considered one. The response time lengthens slightly. The presence becomes selective rather than total. The quality of what remains is more deliberate, more considered, more, and this is the word that keeps returning because it's the right one, intentional. Intentionality wasn't announced. What happened was that the reflex was interrupted long enough for intention to become possible. What the other person experiences during this recalibration is not nothing. The absence of what they'd come to rely on produces its own sensation, which they will interpret through the model they have, and the model doesn't yet include a version of you that has limits. So there is, in the short term, a quality of disorientation that looks like distance. Some of them will say you've changed, and they'll be right in a narrow sense. The behavior has changed. What's actually happened is that the behavior finally caught up with what was true underneath it. The change is not new, it's just for the first time visible. The two people in this aren't unusual. The pattern described here, availability without examination, presence sustained by aversion rather than choice, a structure that reads as generosity from every angle, except the one that would require stopping to look, runs underneath more relationships than most people want to count. It sits below the surface of connections that appear, by every visible measure, to be working. The reason it goes unexamined isn't indifference. It's that the sensation it produces doesn't cross the threshold where examination feels necessary. It accumulates below that threshold consistently, for years sometimes, until something chosen and precise interrupts it, or until nothing interrupts it, and the accumulation eventually finds a different kind of exit. In a professional context where someone has spent years being the person others rely on for steadiness, not for any formal reason, just because they are that way, because something in how they hold themselves in difficult moments signals that they can absorb more than the average. What it actually feels like to be selective about that steadiness for the first time is one of the more clarifying experiences available. Uncomfortable, yes, but clarifying in a way comfort rarely is. What surfaces in the hours after drawing a line that holds is a quality of information about yourself that the pattern, while it was running, made it impossible to access. You find out what you actually want. You find out with some precision what the cost of the previous arrangement really was. And you find out, and this is the one that tends to land hardest, that you were capable of this all along, that the restraint required was always available, that what was missing was not the capacity, but the willingness to experience the sensation that comes with using it. The pattern itself is not the problem. Availability is not the problem. The question, and this is where the segment has to stay honest, which means not providing an answer, is whether what you're doing when you show up for someone is something you could, on any given day, choose not to do. Whether the presence is deliberate and considered and patient in the way that real presence is, or whether it's running on something older and less examined than any of that. If you could stop easily, without the specific internal friction that comes from interrupting a reflex rather than making a choice, what would that tell you about why you haven't? There's nothing to resolve here. That's not a stylistic choice. It's accurate. The thing described across these segments doesn't have a resolution in the conventional sense, a point at which you've done enough examination and can return to your life with the pattern corrected. What changes, when anything changes, is more modest and more durable than resolution. It's simply that you begin to notice. Not always, not with perfect consistency, but with enough regularity that the reflex and the choice start to feel distinct from each other. The sensation that accompanies not responding, not absorbing, not showing up automatically, that sensation doesn't disappear, but it stops being the thing that decides. It becomes instead information, something that registers and then gets weighed, rather than something that simply wins. In a quiet moment that most people have had, and few people have stayed in long enough, the moment after you've said yes to something you didn't want to do, when the other person has already moved on, and you're still there holding the residue of the exchange, what surfaces if you let it is not resentment. Not exactly. It's more like a very specific, very patient question about what you thought was going to happen if you'd said something different, what you were protecting. Whether the thing you were protecting still needs protecting, or whether it needed protecting once, and the response became permanent after the original reason dissolved. Most people don't stay in that moment. The next thing arrives and they move to it, which is, well, it's understandable. The next thing is always arriving, but the moment is still there when you come back to it, which you can, which is one of the few genuinely useful things about this kind of examination. It doesn't expire. The question you didn't ask yourself 6 years ago is still available. The pattern you haven't looked at directly is still there to be looked at. Nothing about this requires a dramatic intervention or a confrontation or a comprehensive accounting of every accommodation you've ever made. It just requires at some point the willingness to stop moving long enough to ask which of the two things you're doing. Whether that's a question you're ready to sit with, not answer, just sit with, is something only you can determine. And even that framing might be too neat. I'm not sure readiness is the right category here. Readiness implies a state you arrive at. What this might be closer to is a decision that you make before you feel ready, precisely because the feeling of readiness is one of the things the pattern produces to keep itself intact. If these ideas have been useful, if something here landed in a way that the usual advice doesn't, subscribing is the simplest way to keep that going. It takes 1 second, and it means these conversations reach more people who might need them. That actually matters. What would it mean specifically if it turned out that the people who needed you most had actually needed you to be less available all along?